Okay, we are going to go over two standards today. First standard is standard 6K, which says demonstrate knowledge of the civil rights and women's movements. And standard 6L says analyze U.S. leadership and world affairs from the collapse of the Soviet Union to the present. Obviously, the embedded concepts of standard 6K would be to know about the civil rights movements that happened in the U.S., as well as the various women's movements. You have the embedded concepts of standard 6L, which would be to know and focus on how the U.S. played the leadership role in various world affairs after the collapse of the Soviet Union to the present day. The critical content for standard 6K would obviously be to focus on the civil rights movements in the U.S. This is the time when they wanted to end segregation. So you have the Montgomery bus boycott, the Greensboro sit-in, Selma to Montgomery march. You have, of course, key figures. You have Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr. You have the groundbreaking Brown versus the Board of Education. And you have the Little Rock and the Little Rock Nine. And you've got, the changing of the acts. You have the Civil Rights Acts of 1964 and the Voting Rights Acts of 1965, so that anyone who is a U.S. citizen could vote, and it doesn't depend on their race. I should obviously focus on the women's movements in the U.S. Women were fighting for the right to vote. You've got Seneca Falls, the National Women's Rights Conference. You've got key figures like Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Stanton. You have the National Women's Suffrage Association, Margaret Sanger, who was big on birth control. And then eventually you got the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, which allowed women to vote. The critical content for Standard 6L is just showing that the U.S. had the upper hand after the collapse of the Soviet Union. We became the dominant world power. So we felt a need to send aid and help to other countries who are struggling, and we had the dominant military and political power. The key skills of Standard 6K and 6L would be to demonstrate knowledge of the civil rights and women's movements. So obviously I have to know both about the civil rights movements and the women's movement. And I have to be able to demonstrate, that's a key verb, my understanding of those two events. I also have to analyze the U.S. leadership and world affairs from the collapse of the Soviet Union to present. So now I would have to focus on how the U.S. leadership was affected after the collapse of the Soviet Union to how it is nowadays. And the key verb is, of course, to analyze. The core task for Standard 6K and 6L would be obviously to read over materials and the resources that I have posted below about the civil rights movements and the women's movements. I need to know it well enough to be able to show and demonstrate my understanding about both of the movements that occurred. I also need to focus on the U.S. post-Cold War to now the present day, and also read about the U.S.'s influence over other countries and what we did in our leadership position after the collapse of the Soviet Union to even nowadays. Some of the resources that I found was some of the civil rights movements. I found this awesome resource from history.com and also this resource. Women's rights movements, I had found this particular resource. And really, I focused on the U.S. after the Cold War, and this just gives some information about how the U.S. was after the Cold War to nowadays, or at least in the recent days. So those were very, very helpful. And that was Standard 6K and 6L.